$886 billion. That is what the United States spent on its military in 2024. More than any nation in human history, by a margin that defies easy comprehension. The U.S. accounts for roughly 37% of all military spending on Earth. The next 9 countries combined, China, Russia, India, Saudi Arabia, and others, still don't match it. But why? Why does a nation at peace spend more on war than anyone else ever has? The answer isn't simple. It's wrapped in history, fear, politics, and power. The United States maintains over 750 military bases in more than 80 countries. It operates 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. The rest of the world operates 12 total, combined. Its Air Force alone would be the second most powerful military on the planet. Its Navy patrols every ocean simultaneously, 365 days a year. This global presence is not accidental. It is strategic, and it is expensive. Of that $886 billion, roughly $167 billion goes to military personnel, salaries, healthcare, housing. The U.S. employs 1.3 million active duty service members and another 800,000 in reserve. Veteran benefits and care at another $300 billion on top of the Defense Department's budget. When you include those costs, total national security spending exceeds $1 trillion annually. Every year, Congress debates, and every year, it passes a budget larger than the year before. Since 1950, U.S. military spending has never fallen below $300 billion in inflation-adjusted dollars. To understand why, you have to go back to the ashes of World War II. The war killed 70 to 85 million people. It reshaped every border on Earth.
London celebrates. The royal family at Buckingham Palace joined.
When it ended, America stood as the world's only undamaged major economy. And it had the bomb, the only nation on Earth with nuclear weapons. America chose not to withdraw. It chose to build a new world order, with itself at the center. In 1949, it created NATO, a military alliance committing American power to the defense of Europe. Then the Soviet Union tested its first nuclear weapon. The Cold War had begun. Both superpowers entered an arms race that would define the next 4 decades. In 1961, President Eisenhower warned the nation. He called it the military-industrial complex, a permanent alliance between the armed forces and the weapons industry, feeding on fear and money. Vietnam cost $840 billion in today's dollars. It changed how America thought about war. But it did not shrink the military. If anything, it accelerated technological investment. Reagan's defense buildup in the 1980s added $2 trillion to military spending over a decade. When the Soviet Union collapsed, many expected a peace dividend, a smaller military, less spending. Instead, within 2 years, the U.S. was at war in the Persian Gulf. Then came September 11th, 2001, and everything changed again. Within weeks, America was at war in Afghanistan. Within 18 months, in Iraq as well. The defense budget nearly doubled in a decade, from $300 billion to over $700 billion. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan would ultimately cost an estimated $8 trillion, including long-term care for veterans. New forms of warfare, drones, cyber operations, special forces, required entirely new investment. U.S. Cyber Command's budget alone grew to over $3 billion annually by the 2020s. In 2019, the Space Force was established, a 6th branch of the military for the new frontier. America has more military satellites than any other nation. critical to GPS, communications, and targeting. The budget is vast, the bureaucracy is vaster, and it has momentum that is almost impossible to stop. In 2023 alone, defense contractors spent over $140 million lobbying Congress. Companies like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman each earned tens of billions from government contracts. Defense manufacturing employs nearly 3 million Americans across all 50 states. When a weapons program gets cut, it's not just a strategic decision, it's a political one. Jobs are on the line. The F-35 fighter jet program is the most expensive weapons system in human history. Total projected cost, over $1.7 trillion across its lifetime. Per plane, roughly $100 million. Critics call it plagued by delays and overruns. The Pentagon calls it essential. A single Gerald R. Ford-class aircraft carrier costs $13 billion to build, before crew and operations. Operating one carrier group for a year costs over $3 billion more. The B-21 Raider, America's newest stealth bomber, costs $700 million per plane. Modernizing the nuclear arsenal, missiles, submarines, bombers, is projected to cost $1.7 trillion over 30 years. America maintains a nuclear triad, land-based missiles, submarines, and bombers, all simultaneously. This redundancy is intentional, a guarantee that a first strike could never destroy all retaliatory capacity. But critics argue it's far more than deterrence requires, and that the costs are unsustainable. Roughly 16% of the federal budget goes to defense. That's more than the entire federal education budget. Teams 3. For what one F-35 costs, you could hire 1,000 teachers for a year. The Army operates over 6,000 tanks. Russia has more, but many are obsolete. China is catching up fast. China is the emerging challenger, spending roughly $225 billion in 2024, and growing fast. The Pentagon points to China's growth as justification for sustained American investment. The South China Sea, Taiwan, and the Pacific have become flashpoints in a new great power competition. A potential conflict over Taiwan, a scenario military planners take seriously, could be catastrophically expensive. War games run by the Rand Corporation in 2023 suggested a Taiwan conflict could see massive losses on all sides. Then Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, and military spending surged across the Western world. The U.S. has provided over $175 billion in aid to Ukraine, much of it military equipment. Javelin anti-tank missiles, HIMARS rocket systems, Patriot batteries, all paid for by American taxpayers. And as those weapons were depleted, the defense industry was called on to replace them, at great cost. NATO allies are now under pressure to meet a 2% GDP defense spending target, a standard the U.S. far exceeds. America's NATO commitment is partly why it shoulders such a disproportionate share of the alliance's defense burden. This has become a major political flashpoint, with leaders questioning whether allies are paying their fair share. Beyond conventional forces, the U.S. Special Operations Command operates in over 80 countries. These missions rarely make headlines, but they consume billions in training, equipment, and operations annually. The drone program alone involves thousands of aircraft and a global network of operators and analysts. Drone operations in Somalia, Yemen, Syria, and Pakistan have continued for over 15 years. The 18 agencies of the intelligence community add another $100 billion to the total national security price tag. The NSA alone employs over 30,000 people and operates the world's largest signals intelligence network. Cybersecurity has become a new battlefield, and it requires entirely new investments, constantly. After Russian hackers breached SolarWinds in 2020, cyber defense funding surged by billions. Here's a shocking fact. The Pentagon has never passed a complete financial audit. Since the Department of Defense was first required to audit itself in 1990, it has consistently failed. The GAO has flagged the Pentagon as a high-risk organization for financial management since 1995. Procurement waste is legendary. $640 toilet seats, $7,600 coffee makers, $400 hammers. Oversight is weak, contractors are powerful, and the incentive to cut costs is nearly non-existent. Many defense contracts are cost-plus, meaning the more a contractor spends, the more profit they make. The revolving door between the Pentagon and the defense industry is well documented and widely criticized. Hundreds of senior military officers retire each year and move directly into defense contractor roles. These relationships create a system where military needs and corporate profits become nearly indistinguishable. One aircraft carrier costs more than the entire federal school lunch program for 2 years. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of American veterans struggle with homelessness and food insecurity. The Veterans Administration remains chronically underfunded even as the Pentagon budget grows. The gap between what the country spends to make war and what it spends to heal warriors is vast. The military spends over $1 billion annually on recruiting and marketing. It sponsors NASCAR races, esports tournaments, and music festivals to attract young recruits. Even so, the military missed its recruiting goals by tens of thousands in 2023. A significant crisis. Service members receive housing, food, health care, and education benefits, which add substantially to total costs. The true cost of maintaining a professional, volunteer military is enormous compared to conscript armies of the past. DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, funds some of the world's most consequential research. The Internet began as a DARPA project. GPS was military. Microwave ovens emerged from radar research. Military R&D has generated enormous civilian benefits, a fact its defenders frequently cite. Today, DARPA funds autonomous vehicles, advanced AI, hypersonic weapons, and quantum computing. The hypersonic missile race with China and Russia has triggered billions in new R&D investment. Artificial intelligence is now at the center of the military's vision for future warfare. DARPA's autonomous swarm programs envision hundreds of low-cost drones replacing expensive platforms. The Pentagon's 2023 AI strategy called for integrating machine learning across all domains of conflict. The rise of commercial space partnerships with SpaceX, Rocket Lab, and others marks a new era. Commercial satellites proved decisive in Ukraine, a lesson the Pentagon is rapidly absorbing. Space is now considered a contested warfighting domain, and space defense is a new spending priority. After China demonstrated an anti-satellite weapon, the U.S. accelerated its space resilience programs. Undersea internet cables, carrying 95% of global data, are now a recognized military vulnerability. Protecting and potentially threatening these cables has become a new strategic priority. Russia and China have both been accused of surveilling undersea infrastructure with research vessels. The world has become more complex, more connected, and, in many ways, more dangerous. And the military budget reflects that. Every year, the debate rages. Is this money well spent? Is it enough? Is it too much? Libertarian critics argue the U.S. should withdraw from its global commitments and radically reduce spending. Hawks argue the opposite, that any reduction invites aggression and emboldens adversaries. Progressive critics point to crumbling infrastructure, underfunded schools, and healthcare gaps at home. Realist scholars argue the U.S. has overextended itself, trying to police a world that doesn't want policing. Afghanistan, 20 years, $2.3 trillion spent, and the Taliban returned to power within days of U.S. withdrawal. Iraq, The weapons of mass destruction were never found. The war catalyzed ISIS and regional chaos. Critics argue America's military interventions have often created the very instability they were meant to prevent. Libya, after the 2011 intervention, descended into years of civil war and became a hub for human trafficking. But defenders point to Ukraine, where U.S. military aid has helped a democracy resist full-scale invasion. Without American weapons, many analysts argue, Ukraine would have fallen within weeks. South Korea, defended by American troops since 1953, is now one of the world's most prosperous democracies. Japan, under the U.S. security umbrella, built an economic miracle, spending almost nothing on defense for decades. America's Navy keeps the world's shipping lanes open, a public good that benefits every trading nation. The freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf, the South China Sea, and the Pacific, policed by the U.S. Navy. Some economists call this the provision of global public goods, and argue it's worth the price. Without American naval dominance, oil transport could be disrupted, affecting energy prices worldwide. Small democracies on the frontiers of great powers depend on American security guarantees for their survival. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, once occupied by the Soviet Union, now shelter under NATO's nuclear umbrella. The presence of American troops in Europe is not symbolic. For many nations, it is existential. The core logic of military spending is deterrence. If you're strong enough, no one will attack. America's nuclear arsenal is the ultimate deterrent. 5,500 warheads capable of ending civilization. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction has prevented nuclear war for 80 years. So far, critics argue this creates a false sense of security, and that nuclear proliferation makes the world less safe, not more. Stopping adversaries from acquiring nuclear weapons has justified everything from sanctions to covert operations. North Korea acquired nuclear weapons despite American opposition, complicating the deterrence calculus. As more nations acquire nuclear weapons, the cost and complexity of American deterrence only grows. Some strategists argue the U.S. is overinvested in legacy systems, carriers and tanks, for the wars of the future. A $15 billion aircraft carrier can potentially be sunk by a $50,000 drone strike. The math is changing. Ukraine proved that cheap drones can destroy expensive tanks. The doctrine of high-cost platforms is being challenged. Reformers argue for a leaner force. More drones, AI, and cyber capability, fewer legacy platforms. But the political economy makes reform brutally difficult. Contractors fight every cut. Congress protects home state jobs. Former Defense Secretary Robert Gates said cutting defense is one of the hardest things a secretary can do. When Congress imposed automatic cuts in 2013, the military warned of catastrophic readiness failures. Military readiness is a real concern. Many units lack adequate training time, spare parts, and qualified personnel. The U.S. Navy has had a string of embarrassing mechanical failures and collisions in recent years. The military also faces a mental health crisis. Suicide rates among veterans remain alarmingly high. The hidden costs of war, PTSD, addiction, broken families, don't appear on the Pentagon's balance sheet. Brown University's Cost of Wars project estimates the post-9/11 wars have cost $8 trillion and counting. The U.S. national debt stands at over $34 trillion. Military spending has contributed significantly. Interest payments on the debt now exceed the entire defense budget, a staggering reversal. The Congressional Budget Office warns that without reform, debt will reach 200% of GDP by 2050. Every dollar spent on a bomber is a dollar not spent on roads, research, or reducing the deficit. Nobel economist Joseph Stiglitz has argued that the Iraq War alone contributed to the 2008 financial crisis. Defense spending requires deficit financing, borrowing that costs future generations real money. A generation crushed by student debt and housing costs inherits a military bill they did not vote for. America's infrastructure scores a C-, according to the American Society of Civil Engineers. Cities like Flint, Michigan struggled with poisoned water while the Pentagon bought new fighter jets. Defenders respond, a weak military would cost far more in wars we'd be forced into, in alliances that collapse. History offers warnings. The 1930s showed what happens when democracies underspend on defense. As Churchill noted, the cost of strength is always less than the cost of being weak at the wrong moment. With simultaneous crises in Ukraine, the Middle East, the Pacific, and the Sahel, the argument for readiness is strong. The military is also a humanitarian force, providing disaster relief, medical aid, and evacuation worldwide. After Haiti's 2010 earthquake, the U.S. military deployed 22,000 troops for disaster relief in days. No other nation can project this kind of humanitarian power at global scale, and quickly. The question is not whether power matters. It is how much power, at what cost, and to what end. The military of the future will look radically different from today's, but it will likely cost just as much. Artificial intelligence will make decisions faster than humans can, and that raises profound ethical questions. Lethal autonomous weapons, machines that can select and kill targets, are closer to reality than most people realize. Calls for a treaty banning autonomous lethal weapons have stalled, with the U.S. resisting binding limits. China has explicitly targeted AI dominance as a military goal, triggering a new kind of arms race. Silicon Valley's relationship with the Pentagon has become contentious and central to military modernization. In 2018, Google employees resigned in protest over a Pentagon AI contract, forcing the company to back out. A new generation of defense tech startups has risen to fill the gap, with billions in Pentagon funding. Drone swarms that can overwhelm any air defense system are being tested by all major powers. Quantum computing could crack any existing encryption, making secure communications suddenly vulnerable. The next major conflict may begin not with bombs, but with a cyber attack on power grids or financial systems. America's civilian infrastructure is deeply vulnerable, and the military's cyber mission is expanding to protect it. Biological weapons are another frontier, and pandemic preparedness has become a national security issue. COVID-19 demonstrated how a biological event can paralyze society. The military's medical role is growing. DARPA and BARDA have invested billions in rapid vaccine development and biological threat detection. Climate change is officially classified as a national security threat by the Pentagon. Norfolk, Virginia, home to the world's largest naval base, is among America's most flood-threatened cities. Climate migration, resource wars, and extreme weather events are expected to stress military operations globally. The melting Arctic is opening new strategic frontiers, and Russia and China are already moving in. The U.S. has just 2 operational heavy icebreakers. Russia has 40, a gap that demands expensive new investment. The Nuclear Modernization Program, Sentinel ICBM, Columbia submarines, B-21 bombers, is entering its most expensive phase. The Sentinel ICBM program alone has seen cost overruns exceeding 37%, triggering a congressional review. The Pentagon has been forced to acknowledge that nuclear modernization may cost far more than projected. Some former officials argue for a smaller, more selective nuclear arsenal, focused on survivability, not quantity. With the New START treaty expired and no replacement in sight, arms control architecture is collapsing. China is projected to triple its nuclear arsenal by 2035, making old bilateral frameworks obsolete. For the first time in history, the U.S. may need to deter 2 nuclear near-peers simultaneously. The Pentagon's strategy explicitly names this as its defining challenge, and it will define spending for a generation. Defense spending is projected to grow to over $1 trillion annually by 2030 under current plans. At that level, combined with interest on the debt, discretionary domestic spending will be nearly squeezed out. A bipartisan commission warned in 2024 that America's defense is dangerously underfunded for the threats it faces. But others argue the opposite, that the U.S. is trapped in a security mindset that produces more threats, not fewer. Every dollar spent on diplomacy and development, some argue, prevents $10 of future military spending. The State Department's budget is roughly $60 billion, less than 7% of the Pentagon's. Foreign aid, development assistance, and diplomacy remain chronically underfunded relative to military options. As former Defense Secretary Mattis famously said, "If you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition." Today, the politics of defense spending have shifted. Both parties support high military budgets for different reasons. Republicans emphasize the China threat, nuclear modernization, and countering adversaries through strength. Democrats emphasize alliances, collective security, and preventing authoritarian aggression in Europe. A growing isolationist wing argues for retrenchment, letting allies fend for themselves while America rebuilds at home. Polls show Americans are divided. Roughly equal numbers want to increase, maintain, or cut defense spending. Younger Americans are more skeptical of military spending than older generations, and their views will shape the future. For military families, this isn't abstract. It's a life of deployments, sacrifice, and service. More than 400,000 American service members are buried at Arlington. The cost in human life is incalculable. Behind every budget line is a family that has given something, sometimes everything, in service to the nation. The debate over military spending is inseparable from the question of what it means to use that military. Some of America's greatest strategic victories came not from military force, but from diplomacy backed by strength. Nixon's opening to China in 1972, Reagan's negotiations with Gorbachev, the Camp David Accords. Today's world is more multipolar, more contested, and more resistant to simple military solutions. The greatest threats of the 21st century, climate change, pandemics, inequality, aren't solved by aircraft carriers. The fundamental question remains, is spending nearly $1 trillion a year the best way to make Americans and the world safe? There are no easy answers. The men and women who serve deserve the best, in equipment, in care, and in judgment about when they are sent. The world is dangerous. American power has at times made it more stable, at times less so. $886 billion, enough to eliminate hunger globally for 13 years, to rebuild every road in America, or to maintain the most powerful military in human history. America chooses the military year after year, budget after budget. The choice reflects values, fears, and priorities. In a democracy, that choice belongs to the people. It deserves to be made with open eyes and full information. Now you know why. What happens next is up to you. Like and subscribe, and let us know what other mystery should we break down.